What's up, dudes? Max here, and welcome back to another episode of Real Talk. And this one's pretty important and is going to encompass a lot, because today we're talking about why patches are good for fighting games. Not only a few days ago was the 5th anniversary to one of the craziest, most open-ended AAA fighting games that has been released in the past decade, and it was Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Any of the Marvel vs. titles that have been developed from Capcom kind of carry this design tradition, where they allow the player a lot of expression with the characters, especially the team composition, and purposely leave things open-ended to creativity. However, leaving things open-ended in a player environment where almost all the hardcore players are simply there just to break the rules, of course, is going to lead to some nasty things down the line. Now, specifically for this Real Talk video and the topic at hand, I'm going to use the Marvel vs. Capcom series, as well as Marvel vs. Capcom 3 specifically, as an example of the importance of patches for fighting games. Ultimate Marvel 3 was released within a year's time of its vanilla predecessor back in early 2011. And like the previous Marvel games, Ultimate was a regular expansion with brand new characters and a heavy amount of patches and adjustments to the existing roster. But it wasn't just that. There was something that was specific in the first version of Marvel 3 that was plaguing the game, as well as its high-end competition and team selection, and it was something called the DHC glitch. It completely reset the damage scaling of combos, but only specific characters could set it up easily based on their supers. This heavily stifled the playability of the game at higher level, but it was immediately remedied in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where the overall glitch was just removed. Now, moving forward, after Ultimate Marvel 3 had been out for some time, we all know the eventual history of the game and where it would eventually go to. Optimized combos for several characters amongst the roster, especially those that were higher tier, some of the best assists that you would see used over and over and over again, and we kind of have a repeat from previous Marvel games, especially Marvel vs. Capcom 2, where a lot of the game is dominated by a few characters, and the really exciting stuff is when someone pulls out other characters that you usually don't see, and they totally whoop ass. However, within a year after the release of Ultimate Marvel 3, we would no longer see any updates to the game, no changes to its netcode, no adjustments to the roster. The game was the way it was, and it was going to stay that way, just like the old days. This all eventually led from Marvel being one of the most popular games in the FGC to just another fighting game that's still supported amongst its hardcore audience, but really isn't played that much outside of just that audience. But let's say that Ultimate Marvel 3 continually got the support from Capcom and Marvel. Let's say that Capcom did not lose the Marvel license and continually was able to support and change and adjust certain elements in Ultimate Marvel 3, similar to some of their other games, like Street Fighter. Issues like the TAC Infinite could be completely removed, limiting the amount of combo you can do after a TAC. Select characters really high on the tier list could be bumped down a little bit, while some other characters that aren't used nearly as much could get a small boost in what they could do, changing up overall team composition, especially assist usage. And not to mention, one of the biggest gripes I had with Ultimate Marvel 3 is that a lot of the newer characters that were introduced into the game completely break the rules of a core design mechanic. The longer the combo, the greater the opponent has a chance to pop out of it eventually, simply because combos could only be so long in Marvel 3 because they're eventually going to scale out of it. The amount of hits done is going to decrease to a small fraction where the opponent's just going to simply drop out of the combo, meaning you have to optimize your combos based on those situations. But a ton of characters in Ultimate Marvel 3, not to mention many from the original Marvel 3, ignored this mechanic completely, and several of their normal and special moves had hit stun amounts that did not scale at all, meaning that some characters or team compositions could just keep comboing you until you were dead. And while it was rumored for years after the game's release, a patch never happened for the game, but during that time frame there was a giant amount of excitement resonating from the entire Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom community, if not potential players that were looking to get back in, anxious about what could be changing about the game, and reasons for them to jump back once again and try out their characters, along with new team compositions, because patches breathe life into fighting games. But there is a problem. patches can be horrific for a competitive community. If you're a competitive fighting game player and then suddenly the game that you've been practicing for years on end has been flipped on its head, your character's dramatically adjusted, and the things you do no longer work, you're going to be upset, which is why a huge amount of hardcore players specifically despise patches for fighting games. And to be honest, their argument is fairly sound. A lot of the previous fighting games that we grew up with back in arcades did not get patches, only in some very rare situations were arcade boards updated to later versions. A great example is the original Killer Instinct, with another version that was manually updated on thousands of machines, removing game-breaking features like Cinder's Infinite. Hardcore player bases tend to grow around the strengths and weaknesses of characters or mechanics in the game. Simply put, if a mechanic isn't that good or worth it, they're just not going to use it. While the developer would look at this as a situation that they can specifically fix, back in the day, they couldn't really fix it without it being horrifically expensive. Nowadays, you can release a hotfix potentially within hours of a game-breaking bug being found. But after those games being out for so long, let's talk like Third Strike or Marvel vs. Capcom 2, or one of the greatest examples, which is Capcom vs. SNK 2, if we're talking about the Capcom library, these games were the staple of heavily and insanely overpowered characters, along with game-breaking mechanics that would not only break the game, but also make it even more playable. CVS2, like I said, is an amazing example of this because something was discovered a few years after the game's release, which is called roll canceling, applying a little bit of the invincibility that a character normally uses through a roll, and you can actually put it towards a special move. This specific bug in the game, which was never intended by the developers, actually took some characters that were way lower in tier lists and made them a little bit more usable because they can apply invincibility to select special moves. Years down the line, console versions were released, but a lot of the player base stuck to the version that was as close to the arcade as possible because, well, that's where the competitive player base was. And even sometime after that, Capcom actually got their hands on the game once again and made heavy adjustments to it, removing things like the roll canceling glitch in a version called Capcom vs. SNK 2 EO. Guess what happened? The competitive community hated it and they would never play that version. This happened simply because that version of Capcom vs. SNK 2 had been out on the market for so long that the player base had been playing that one version for such a long period of time that there was no way they'd change to a version of the game that removed a mechanic that they actually found to be really fun, while the developers considered to be game-breaking. And that leads us to where we are today. 5 years ago, Ultimate Marvel 3 came out. It's still an amazing open-ended fighting game, and in all honesty, you can probably have more fun in Ultimate Marvel 3's training mode than any other fighting game. I swear to you, every time I go into this thing and start doing combos, I find things that I've never seen other players do before. It's absolutely incredible how much you can pull off in this game, and the amount of creativity they allowed the player to have. And really, if they came back and just slightly adjusted certain things, not stifling player creativity and standing by their original design documents, things like hit stun scaling applying to every single combo, then Ultimate Marvel 3 I think could still be really popular to this day, especially considering if it still had the support. Fighting games nowadays are defined by developer support and patches. If there is new characters that are released, if there are new costumes, if there is adjustments, the player base, however hardcore or casual it might be, will come back to check it out. Patches are really important for fighting games nowadays, because if there's no hope for future development support of your fighting game, then all hope is lost. Any potential conversation about how you would change a character or what character could get introduced is thrown out the window. It's not gonna happen. There was a period where a lot of the community was kind of fed up with Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 because every combo was heavily optimized. TAC combos were the exact same things for several characters, and team compositions kind of boiled down to a few things in many top 8s that a lot of people were just sick of watching. The most exciting thing was watching someone break the mold and do good with a character outside of the normal standard. But for a little bit of time, a couple years after the game's release, there was that huge amount of excitement, like I said, because there was potential rumors for quite some time that Capcom was going to change some stuff about this game. There was going to be a patch for Ultimate Marvel 3, and during that point, the community was ready to go. People were ready to jump back in. There were people still playing because there was life in that game. There was still a chance. But until that very, very sad day came where we found that Capcom and Marvel would no longer be working together, they removed all the games from online digital distribution. You couldn't even purchase the DLC anymore. The contract was over. That's when everyone's heart sank to the bottom of their stomachs because there was never going to be a patch for Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. You kind of have to take things into perspective when it comes to patches for fighting games. Like a lot of developers have said for the past games they have released, if they did have an opportunity to update that game quickly based on immediate feedback and information like we have now, well, they probably would. As always, dudes, thank you a ton for watching. Let me know what you think overall about patches for fighting games down below. I think they can be really good for a huge amount of fighting games, even though some companies have an awkward history of patching games and how they approach potentially overpowered characters, while some companies actually let their fighting game sit in the community for a bit of time as people figure out how good they are or how weak they are. Let me know what you think is best for future patches of a fighting game that you might be playing. As always, guys, thank you a ton for watching. My name is Max, and I'll see you next time.